What single event in history do you think changed the world the most? Invention of the printing press. It allowed the proliferation and spread of ideas at an exponentially higher rate, and it allowed books to become something the masses could afford. The Enlightenment, and by extension the modern world, never could have happened without it. It represented as big of an information revolution as the internet does today. I remember the History Channel naming Guttenberg the most influential person in history, back when it still was a History Channel. I was in Germany in 2000, and there was a big celebration of Guttenberg as the man of the millennium in the town I was staying in. Learning to make fire. I'd go with this one too. We would still be barely evolved bipeds chimpanzees today. I think when some motherfucker decided, hey, why don't we just take these plants we are foraging for and plant them near our huts? That way we can just walk outside and get food rather than walk around looking for it. Great answer. I was going, say the first guy that thought, hey, maybe I don't have to kill that deer / cow / whatever for dinner even though I'm freaking starving. Maybe I can corral him into this pen I've made and get a few of his friends to follow. I guess both of these ideas can be filed under the invention of agriculture itself. Once we had that nailed down, we had more time to sit around and figure out better ways of creating tools and communicating with each other more. Could you imagine our ancestors figuring out agriculture? You see, you gotta mix a little poop into the dirt before planting it. Shut up, Steve. No one wants to eat your poop potatoes. Discovering electricity. We'd still be using letters for communication. Construction tools wouldn't allow us to build any structure more than 10 or so stories. Spark is a key part of an internal combustion engine. So no cars, unless you had a steam engine. A lot more came from the discovery of electricity. There's this neat tool called an MRI which can find a cancer in your body shortly after it forms, rather than finding it slightly after your death. MRI physics is beautifully fascinating. If the Ming Emperor hadn't ushered in a policy of isolation in 1433 in Zengi, who would die shortly after, and his fleet, the largest in the world at the time, had been able to continue exploring, then the world as we know it would be significantly different, as China was the superpower of the 15th century and it just shut its door on the world. We don't have much detail about the ships in that fleet, but the accounts of Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo make them sound like incredible engineering accomplishments for the time. China didn't have nearly as much incentive or need to explore in the 15th and 16th centuries, whereas there were considerable economic incentives for Western Europeans pushing those kingdoms to go on their very risky expeditions and support colonies. China's success in already being the center of trade contributed to them not pushing exploration boundaries. They didn't randomly decide to stop exploring. By the 1430s a new strong Khanate had formed to China's north, which demanded immediate attention to not become UN2, Mongol Boogaloo. Vasily Arkhipov's decision to not fire nuclear torpedoes at American submarines. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Arkhipov was one of the 3 commanders on board his nuclear submarine. In order to use the sub's nuclear weapons, all 3 members had to vote unanimously. Arkhipov's submarine had not received word from Moscow, and US ships were dropping depth charges on their submarine, trying to get it to surface. Thinking nuclear war had already broken out, the submarine commanders thought the charges being dropped were intended to sink the sub, and firing on them would be defensive. When it came to a vote, Arkhipov refused to give approval for use of the nuclear weapons, and the sub surfaced. Had he caved to the wills of the other 2 commanders on the ship, the world would have fell into WWII. Einstein said we'd use rocks on the other side. I believe the quote went something more like, I know not what weapons will be used in WWII, but WWIV will be fought with spears and arrows. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. killed a massive amount of Europeans, changing the course of human history in culture, religion, medicine, etc. Hard to say if all those people survived, what family lines would have stayed and produced world-changing offspring. Taking this further, some political scientists argue that had the population not been culled so much by the plague, there would have never been modern democracy. Some claim that after the plague, the peasants held more power of their lords in feudal Europe because the workforce was so much smaller. This is a very paraphrased version of events. If any historians want to step in and fill in the blanks, be my guest. The plague definitely did reduce the workforce substantially, but it also showed the peasants that their kings weren't protected by God. This realization opened the door for the latter half of the Renaissance and began the motions toward what we know as a state. But it took until 1648 and the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia for our modern democracy to begin its rapid ascension. Although I do believe the Black Plague was one of the most changing events in human history, I'm not sure how much I can subscribe to the idea that democracy wouldn't have formed. In my years of studying political science, I believe that people were always going to form some sort of democracy-esque society. The idea of democracy and republics date back to the Athenians, and I'd like to believe it world came about no matter what. Post-Black Plague was the first time peasants had bargaining power. They got paid in money for the first time and started economically moving upwards. The rise of the middle class, or what passed for a middle class in the 1350s.
The idea of a more meaningful statement must be of one of two kinds.
Invention of antibiotics. Came here to say this. Without antibiotics, the average life expectancy would still be like 45. You get a small cut while tending your garden back in the day, and it could potentially kill you. Another planet hitting the Earth when it was forming. Without that, the Earth wouldn't have enough mass to maintain a dense enough atmosphere to support complex life, like Mars, and there would also be no moon. I mean, if we are going astronomical history, wouldn't the Big Bang be bigger? Technically the Big Bang didn't change the world, because Earth didn't exist yet. Haha, pedantic. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 has to be up there. It set into motion the rise of the British Empire, which shaped the modern world. Norman conquest was Viking long con. Settle northern France, get good. Be so powerful you say fuck it, and invade British Isles. Reshape all of modern society. Boom. The invention of writing. This literally took us from prehistory to history. Good call. Totally agree. I'd love to know how it started, but we'll never know. The invention of vaccination. Just the fact that I'm immune to various diseases that took millions of lives a century or two ago amazes me. The Columbian Exchange. So many cultures and species mixed. For instance, earthworms didn't exist on North or South America before, and that completely changes the plant and wildlife composition. And that's only one of many changes. Worldwide diets changed. Europe was introduced to tomatoes, potatoes, tobacco, chocolate, the fall of the Inca and Aztecs, as well as the whippy art of countless other natives. I'm surprised I haven't seen it mentioned yet. I've seen several historians argue it was the most significant event to happen to the planet since the death of the dinosaurs. The #1 event, no question, was Kalon's invention of cheap, durable, and easily produced paper. Various similar materials existed before, such as papyrus, but lacked at least one of the aforementioned characteristics. The ability to store and transfer information on such a massive scale literally changed the world. Columbus setting up the beginnings of European colonies in America was also massively world-changing. Not necessarily always in a good way, mind you, but definitely a dramatic change. And the introduction of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Confucianism all deserve a spot on the list. Other religions and philosophies grew and evolved over time, but those four in particular have a clear starting point, brought on by a specific person.